Welcome to Women Who Kick Glass, the podcast that dives into the fearless women who changed history and the fights that are still shaping our world today. From suffragists to civil rights activists, these women refuse to back down, breaking barriers and demanding change. And now, here's your host, an advocate, a storyteller, and a woman who kicks glass herself, Ann Potenza.
So this woman's dad thought she was insane, and he paid her a visit to dissuade her from her madness. Meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Let's dive into her life. So we're starting back in 1815 when Elizabeth was born, and she was one of 6 siblings. She actually had 4 sisters and a brother. She came from a very prominent family in her town in New York, and her father was a judge. He was a lawyer. He was part of Congress for a while. He was a Supreme Court judge of New York for 8 years later in his life. So she grew up with wealth, with a lot of privileges that maybe other people at that time wouldn't have. So one of Elizabeth's earliest memories is when she's 4 years old, and when her sister was born, she remembered hearing a relative saying, "What a pity it's a girl." She actually remembers that from one of the first things that she remembers as a child. And it never changed because she only had one brother. Her brother got to go away to college. He actually, when he graduated college and he came back, a very tragic incident happened and he died. So now there's only 5 girls in the family. Her older brother is dead. He was the one that was the apple of her parents' eyes. And Elizabeth at the time was 11 years old. And when her parents were going through that grief, she went into her father and she was trying to console him. And, you know, as he was consoling her, he said to her, "Elizabeth, what a pity that you were born a girl, that you weren't a boy." Something to that effect. That's what she remembers. And so she thought because her brother was gone, there were no more boys in the family. And at that, she didn't understand what it meant from her father for him to be like, it's a shame that you're not a boy, to carry on whatever her brother is. So she thought it was simple. She thought that it was about education. So she's like, you know what? I'll just study. So she dove into so much. She learned Greek. She learned at that time about horses, how to manage horses. She dove into her studies, and she thought that would be the difference, that her father would see that she was worthy. She thought it was education. She tried to go to the same college that her brother had graduated from, but they didn't accept her because she was a woman. So she had to go to the Women's Troy Academy. And while she was there, she even studied harder. She added Latin to her repertoire. She added philosophy. She added even more studies. This woman was educated. So when she came back, she wanted to go to law school, but the New York bar wouldn't allow her in. And she wanted to be important to her father. She wanted to be worthy. And she would hang around and she would study law with him in his office, kind of learn from him. And while she was there, even though she knew that she couldn't be a lawyer, she used to overhear a lot of the conversations that would be carried on in her father's office, because his house, the office was adjoined to their house. So she actually heard a lot of the cases, and she heard a lot of stories about women that were not treated fairly, that were treated less than in some of the court cases that were coming before her father's desk. So that put a little kernel in her brain that even though she cannot study law herself, she was going to do what she could to help women's issues, women's problems that they were not thought of as being important. So she had women's cause as part of her goals. She was also very close to her cousin, Gerrit Smith. He was a philosopher, he was a reformer, and he had a home on one of the stops of the Underground Railroad. So at this time in her life, she started meeting other abolitionists that were part of that movement, and she met her future husband, Henry, at one of these meetings, and he was an anti-slavery speaker. So they soon got married, and one of the requirements she wanted when they got married was to not have the word obey in their marriage vows. And he conceded. He was like, that's fine. So it's kind of good. They had a little bit of liberation at the beginning, because that was not uncommon, that the women had to say obey. It was not required the other way for the men to say that. Interesting. So after they got married, Henry and Elizabeth headed over to London because Henry was going to be speaking at the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And they were very excited, and Elizabeth wanted to participate. And while she was there, she met another abolitionist named Lucretia Mott. And when they were there participating, they found out that they were not allowed to be delegates. The preacher actually told them that he is not going to recognize them. The women had Bibles in their hands, trying to convince the preacher that they had a right to speak because according to the Bible, the women had been held down, and this was a perfect opportunity and a perfect location for them to share what they felt on this subject matter. And the preacher said that if they could convince him that an entire half of the human race in the Bible was trying to keep another half of the entire human race down, he would personally collect all the Bibles in the universe and make a big bonfire out of them. So he refused their appeal. He refused their pleas. So the two women looked at each other and they're like, you know what? We're going to have our own convention. When they got back to America, Henry and Elizabeth and their family that was starting to grow moved to Seneca Falls, New York. 8 years passed, and Elizabeth was very depressed. She was lonely. She was in a rural area. She just had no sense of self. The excitement of what she wanted to do about the Women's Rights Convention was not happening. And happenstance, or is it, she went to a Quaker friend's house in Seneca Falls, New York. And who was there? Lucretia Mott. This is 8 years after they first talked about wanting to do it. And when they saw each other and in the middle of nowhere, they're like, we are not waiting any longer. We are starting this convention. And in 1848, the first women's convention was held in Seneca Falls, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave the keynote address. And this is what she said because it sums up what her path would be after that. We have met here today to discuss our rights and wrongs, civil and political, and not, as some have supposed, to go into the detail of social life alone. We do not propose to petition the legislature to make our husbands just, generous, and courteous, to seat every man at the head of a cradle, and to clothe every woman in male attire. But we are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such as graceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love. Laws which make her the mere dependent on his bounty. It is to protest against such unjust laws as these that we are assembled today, and to have them, if possible, forever erased from our statute books, deeming them a shame and a disgrace to a Christian republic in the 19th century. We have met to uplift woman's fallen divinity upon an even pedestal with man's. And strange as it may seem to many, we now demand our right to vote according to the declaration of under the government under which we live. That was her keynote address. That is part of the speech. And that was the Declaration of Sentiments. It is what Elizabeth and around 100 other delegates at that very first women's convention signed their names to. And it wasn't just women. There was actually men at that convention as well. 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments at the 1848 First National Women's Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. This was the first time it happened, and it wasn't the last. So when we found ourselves in the middle of the Civil War, Elizabeth and many of the other suffragists put the women's movement over to the side and decided to focus their energies on the abolition of slavery. Elizabeth's husband, Henry, was part of the Loyal Nationalist League, which was primarily working on the emancipation of slaves in all states. That was their goal. Elizabeth started a new branch called the Women's Loyal National League, and that was something that the women suffragists got behind, and they went around and gathered the most signatures in that period of history ever. They collected 400,000 signatures to present to Congress for the abolition of slavery. And that was one of the instrumental reasons why we have the 13th Amendment. After the 13th Amendment was passed, the suffragists were then able to focus on getting women the right to vote. There was an organization that they started called the American Equal Rights Association. One of the outlets that Elizabeth was an author of was The Revolution, which was a newspaper that was put out by her organization. The Revolution weekly newspaper was co-founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the two of them worked for many, many years after that point on many of our women's causes. What happened after the 13th Amendment was, once slavery was abolished, the focus was supposed to be for everyone involved in that movement to start focusing on the right to vote for all. But that didn't happen. But the focus was, we have to get the black men to have the vote first, and then we could focus on the women. And that lost them. And that's really created a separation among people who had previously worked together. So it was during this time when they felt like they were betrayed and people were actually campaigning against the women's right to vote because they thought they had to choose one or the other. And Elizabeth and Susan needed support for their newspaper, and they were connected with a Democrat at the time who was known as being racist, but he had a lot of money and he wanted to finance the paper so that they could get their messages out. It was very, very risky to partner with someone who was a racist. And this is when the reputation of racism starts to fall into the women's movement and starts separating and dividing these women. The revolution refused to support the 15th Amendment unless it also included another amendment for the women's right to vote. Fast forward to 1878, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was about 63 years old, and she brought in front of Congress a proposed amendment for the women's right to vote. It didn't pass. It didn't happen. They brought it in front of the Congress 40 more years before we got that right to vote, which became the 19th Amendment. Unfortunately, Elizabeth wasn't around to see that happen, but we benefit because of all the work that she did before to give us that right. So one of the most interesting things that I found out about Elizabeth is she didn't just stop with the women's movement. She also got into writing the women's Bible. Yeah, there is a women's Bible authored by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she had input from like over a dozen other women. And what they did was they went through and they analyzed the Bible, like over 30 books from the Bible, to see how women are portrayed by organized religion. And I encourage you to check it out because it really doesn't look good. I mean, there's a lot of, let's just say, she made some really good points. So now as we think about what Elizabeth Cady Stanton did, her goals, her purpose in life, you think about how does that relate to us? What examples did she leave for us? So that brings us to today. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's message in today's society is to promote equal opportunities for everyone in every aspect of life, from equal pay to business opportunities, from leadership roles, from reproductive rights, from being able to have a say over your own body and your own choices and your own decisions in what you do in your relationships. Her main cause was to push back against any barriers that keep women from achieving the same opportunities as men. Continue the fight, protect your rights. Visit our website at womenwhokickglass.com. You'll find everything there from Planned Parenthood to how to register to vote. Join me next week as we introduce you to another magical woman who fought for women's rights and against slavery, Lucretia Mott. I'm Ann Potenza. Keep fighting the fight.
Thanks for listening to Women Who Kick Glass. Be sure to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. To learn more, contact the show. Visit womenwhokickglass.com. Women Who Kick Glass is executive produced by Lou Valentino. Written by Lou Valentino and Ann Potenza. Until next time, keep kicking glass.